Welcome everybody. I really appreciate your time today. I particularly appreciate guest speakers Lyndon and Jen, and welcome to the Nature Repair Community Zoom. I want to acknowledge the land on which we're meeting. I'm the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, as I'm in Canberra, but I know those Wentworthers will be on the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Birrabirragal people's lands. And yesterday, last night, and this morning, actually, I spoke on the constitutional referendum that is coming up. So the bill that goes through the Parliament that is required to set up the referendum. And I think it reminds me certainly of what important choices we have coming up for us this year. And so just want to acknowledge, as we're doing a Zoom on nature, the custodianship of the Aboriginal people of the lands on which we're all meeting, and also wanted to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So look, last year's, we called this event because last year's State of the Environment report highlighted the perilous state of nature in Australia and the urgent need to take action. It's a big priority for me, and I know it's a big priority for people in Wentworth, including members here in the room today who have been really strongly advocating as well with that. So thank you very much for the support and advocacy you have shown in this area. And I've been really campaigning very hard on areas such as ending native forest logging, because I think this is an area that is super important. It was great to see the Victorian government actually take some action on that yesterday. Let's get the whole country behind this. The government, the federal government, has made a series of commitments to support environmental protection, and as part of implementing them, has brought forward the legislation to create a nature repair market. The market is intended to reward landholders for restoring and protecting nature, as well as provide options for businesses and not-for-profit organisations to invest in nature repair. The bill has bipartisan support, so the major parties both support this, so is very likely to pass the Parliament with limited or no amendments. However, a number of concerns have been raised about the government's proposal. So ahead of the legislation, which is likely to be debated next week, perhaps in the June sitting, but otherwise potentially next week, I wanted to hear from experts on this topic and also hear from the community. Without further ado, I'd like to also introduce our guest speakers. So I have Lyndon Schneiders, is the Executive Director of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation, and formerly the National Director of the Wilderness Society. Lyndon has spent a lifetime of actively supporting biodiversity and restoration, from the front lines of old growth forests to lobbying for powerful policy changes. Through ACBF, he pulls together what he calls a constellation of humans for maximum impact. As a spokesperson, public speaker, writer and strategist, he maintains a core value of doing better through collaboration, and that is absolutely critical. And as someone who's working now in the Parliament on environmental and climate issues, it is when people are collaborating that we actually have the greatest chance of getting really constructive outcomes. Jennifer Barwick is the Climate and Nature Coordinator for Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew works with Indigenous people, scientists, conservation organisations, industry and government agencies to conserve Australia's critical natural landscapes and marine habitats. Jen Barwick leads Pew's work to secure federal and state policy measures that mobilise carbon, natural capital finance and other nature-based solutions that drive large-scale land restoration, conservation management outcomes. Prior to joining Pew, Jen worked as a senior policy advisor for the South Australian Department of Primary Industry and Regions, and as a journalist. So I'm very grateful to Lyndon and Jennifer, Jen, for joining today. Appreciate your time and chance to brief the good people of Wentworth. So in terms of the format for this evening, I'll be asking our experts on what the legislation is all about, discuss concerns that people have voiced and get in their views on what improvements are needed. We'll have about 35 minutes of pre-submitted questions and then 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A from the chat. And so Joe and Kath from my team will be sort of managing the chat and getting those out to me. Sound good, everyone? Make sense? Any questions? Great. We'll move. Right. So I'm going to start with you, Lyndon. Tell me just at a high level, what is the state of the environment in Australia at the moment?
Thanks, Allegra, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to your constituents and talk about these very pertinent issues. First thing I want to say is I don't want to be that guy who says everything's terrible. I don't want to be that guy. I've been involved in environmental advocacy since my late teens, and I'm 54 now. So, you know, I've had a fair old bandwidth of the last 30 or 35 years of environmental policy and contestation in Australia. So I don't want to be that guy that says everything's terrible, because look, practically as a country, there has been a number of really important and positive changes that have occurred in this country over the last 30 years in the lifetime that I've been an activist. So my first answer won't be that everything's terrible. I have seen through my own eyes, how much positive change has happened. I've seen how much community attitudes have changed, particularly as an advocate, you know, from the days when even walking into a room with decision makers was greeted with intense hostility, to one which is now greeted with intense interest and concern. But the data, the environmental data, the scientific data does not correlate with the changed levels of community opinion and concern. There's a number of problems Australia is confronting. They're documented quite extensively. Australia is actually quite good at documenting the state of the environment and sadly of environmental decline. Since 1996, the Australian government has published a 5-yearly report called the Australian State of Environment Report, which detailed a series of indicators around environmental health. It was something that came out of a governmental commitment in the early 1990s to ecologically sustainable development. One of the principles of ecologically sustainable development was that you need to establish a baseline to establish how you were improving the state of the environment. And so the State of Environment Report was one of the first manifestations of that. Now, the sad reality of the State of Environment reportage over the now almost, God, it must be it's almost 25 years, more than 25 years, is each report that's been issued over those 5-yearly periods has said, on almost all the key indicators of environmental health, Australia continues to pursue decline in environmental conditions. There are notable areas where things have got better. You think about even Sydney Harbour. Clearly, Sydney Harbour is a much better nick now than it was 50 years ago. But then you compare it and baseline it to what Sydney Harbour was like pre-European colonisation to 1750. Clearly, it is a substantially diminished environment. And that is the story across the Australian landscape. There's a number of reasons for this. And there is a hierarchy of these issues. One of them is obviously the introduction of a whole bunch of species into our environment, which, you know, the Australian landscape was not used to, particularly hard-hooved animals such as, you know, cows and horses and what have you. You know, animals like cats who, you know, have a particular habit of eating native wildlife. But possibly the single biggest driver of environmental decline across all the indicators has been the extent in which we have modified the environment. Australia is a world champion converter of forested landscapes in particular into agricultural landscapes. So we've cleared about 120 million hectares since, you know, colonisation, which is a mind-bogglingly large area. And the areas we've cleared because they are the most productive parts of the landscape. They are the ones with the good soils, they're the ones with the regular water, they're the ones with the highest rainfall. They were, unsurprisingly, the areas of the highest concentrations of biodiversity pre-colonisation. So we've cleared 120 million hectares, particularly down the east coast and over in southwest WA. But we've also modified, you know, most of the remaining 100-odd million hectares of forests that still remain in Australia. Those actions, which have accumulated over many years, are the things that have turned Australia from a land of abundance, which Australia appeared to be pre-colonisation. Not only did we have broad and diverse species, a range of incredible biological diversity, but also those species lived in abundance. They weren't just, you know, 20 of X or 20 of Y, there were millions. You know, you read the early colonial records of Australia, particularly the eastern coast and southwestern Australia, and people talked of, you know, the harbours full of whales and the sky full of wildlife and birds and the forest full of birdsong and noise. And that's the thing we have lost. So there are a bunch of other drivers around why we've got problems. There's the role of invasive species, there's all pervasive problems around climate change, which is altering the nature of our environment and habitat requirements. But at our essence, it was the foundational colonial project of converting our forests and our woodlands to agricultural land that brought the single biggest change to our environment. And that's what we're dealing with now. So that is still the biggest issue. Every one of those state environment reports identify the top 3 threats to the environment and the features that are continuing to lead to decline. They are habitat modification. That means land clearing. You know, it's just to be clear, we've cleared in Australia about 20 million hectares even since 2000. So that's not a historical construct. That's something that's happened in all of our recent lifetimes. We continue to log high conservation value forests and degrade those forests. The second and third factors are things like the extent of feral animals and the role that feral animals are having in destroying wildlife. And the third biggest threat, as identified by the State Environment Report, is climate change. So that's where we're at. We haven't reversed the decline. We've made some good improvements in the last 20 years, but we've got a long way to go.
Okay. Thank you, Lyndon, for that. Maybe I'll come to you, Jen, on this. How has the government said they will address this crisis?
So, yeah, and so I guess the first thing they have really did sort of in October last year is committed to no new extinctions, so and released a plan to address threatened species. Then they followed that up in December with a plan called the Nature Positive Plan that was largely in response to the State of the Environment Report and also the review of Australia's environmental laws, which are very, very broken. So, and that plan pretty much outlined some of the things they're doing. It didn't come with financial commitments, but it did for national environment significance, new standards for offsets, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They're creating a new environmental protection agency, which I think has been quite largely welcomed. They're going to establish new regional planning, and essentially what they mean by that is they're creating these regional plans that all sort of have a traffic light system that sort of identify the areas that are the areas that need to be protected, the areas that should be restored, and the areas that maybe are appropriate for sustainable development. And the areas that are sort of the priority areas for action and investment. And it also made a commitment for a nature repair market. There were other commitments under that Nature Positive Plan. It's online, it's worth having a look at. Yeah, and that's essentially sort of the major commitment, which I think we're talking through a little bit later.
And also, I guess, what about commitments, including the commitments? Does that cover all the commitments they made also at Montreal? I'm just trying to make sure.
No, so that was so that's the international commitment. So
yeah.
So they went to the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD it's called, or COP15, and they signed on, became a signatory to something that's called the Lyndon, you probably know this better than me, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which essentially sets out a series of global targets that the international signatories are using to address biodiversity loss and restore ecosystems internationally. So by 2030. So similar to the Paris Agreement and the COP 27 or 28 we're up to now, and there's now an international commitment to restore and conserve biodiversity, which is excellent to see. And I guess, you know, out of that commitment, there's a number of targets Australia has signed on to, and that includes conserving 30% of Australia's terrestrial lands and oceans for conservation. So, and it also committed to 30% of areas of degraded areas to being restored. So they're pretty significant commitments that we were very happy to see. There are others, but yeah.
Being restored. Thank you. Lyndon, is there anything else you wanted to add onto, you know, some of those government commitments, or anything Jen you wanted to add about the state of the environment as well, before we move on to the Nature Repair Act, in particular, nature repair market?
Jen, is there anything you want to say about state of environment? I've probably got a bit more to say about.
No, Lyndon, I think you nailed it. You know, it's definitely degraded, and I think the words were that the overall state of Australia's environment is poor and continues to deteriorate. So, we've got some pretty bad international rep as well on that front. Like, we're the worst for mammalian extinction, worst land clearing rates for, I think, in the OECD. So they're not, it's not great.
In terms of, that's a very succinct summary.
You were much more.
I tried to do anyway. Look, I think the things to think about in terms of the government's response and the thing to judge them against, I guess, is a few things. And this goes to the heart of where Nature Repair Bill fits in. But the review that Jen mentioned by Graham Samuel, who was the former head of the Australian Competition Commission, in 2019, was a bit of it was a very significant review. Like, governments do reviews all the time, as Allegra would know. There's reviews on everything under the sun, and there's reports being generated at a rate of knots. But what was interesting about Samuel's review is, one, who wrote it, so a very conservative figure, and secondly, how clear he and his team were in the prescriptions for how to arrest what seemed to have been a protracted and almost irreversible problem. And he looked very closely at the objects that sit behind the national environment laws. We have a piece of legislation called the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is a fantastic name because it's very directive, right? It says we're going to protect the environment, we're going to conserve biodiversity. And one of the first things, bringing a new sort of way of looking at the problem that he observed, was it was a piece of legislation that focused on process, not outcomes, right? So it focused on describing and naming problems and describing and naming processes to resolve problems, but it didn't actually have anything hardwired into it which could achieve the name that was on the front of the can. So there's not much, if anything, inside a very substantial piece of legislation. It covers several hundred pages, which actually enables the government of the day to conserve the biodiversity and protect the environment. So we are fantastic as a country in building really extensive lists of, and ever-growing lists, of how many threatened species we have. What our national environment laws don't do, however, is provide a pathway to enable us to do something with all that information. So Samuel's report was quite profound. It said fundamentally we have a problem. The key piece of legislation that governs how we protect the environment is actually incapable of delivering on its core objective, and things had to change. And for Samuel's, the thing that had to change was that we had to actually build legislatively backed, ironclad, and difficult to influence politically outcomes into decision-making about how we approve developments, and secondarily, how we put in place conservation plans and policies that actually protect and restore the key components of the environment. We're a very rich and smart country, and we've been badly served by the fact that our existing legislative settings do not channel how rich and smart we are, but in fact create almost endless bureaucracy without real clear, hard
outcomes. Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Lyndon. And what I might do then is move on to the nature repair market. I mean, we could do an entire evening on the Samuel review as it is, but let's move to this because that's the bill that is coming towards us. So, Jenna, I might start with you in terms of if you could explain, what is the nature repair market and how is it meant to improve the state of nature in Australia?
Yes. So, I mean, the main thing is that, look, they're creating a regulated framework under government, under legislation, that is designed to essentially help businesses, help private investment, direct funds into delivering nature repair, or being able to invest in projects that will deliver biodiversity conservation or restoration. So the idea of it being a regulated market is that it's meant to basically set the rules on measuring how you measure biodiversity conservation, how you monitor that biodiversity conservation, how you report on that biodiversity conservation. It sets the standards on how and what we need in terms of verification, and so to set sort of the trust and integrity that we need in terms of making sure that these projects are delivering on biodiversity conservation that they're supposed to be delivering. It's meant to sort of publicly track the way that this money is being invested. It's supposed to direct that money into areas of priority that we require in terms of the areas that are of greatest risk or certain species that we want to restore and protect. And so I think that's the plan. I think so that's where it's at. There's a piece of overarching legislation right now coming into Parliament, which is going to set the standards or set the overarching rules on how this market will work. And then under that will be a series of regulations that then lay out how these projects will work, what methods will be deployed, that they will be science-based, and what are the transparency in terms of reporting. And that will all come after this first piece of legislation gets through Parliament, hopefully.
Okay. And tell me, are there examples of anything like this functioning internationally?
This will be the first nationally regulated market in the world, but there are a number of initiatives globally and even in Australia that are essentially developing things called like a biodiversity credit. So projects that do the same idea as what a regulated market would do in terms of creating a mechanism to attract funding to deliver biodiversity conservation in a transparent, high integrity, reporting and verification, and to apply like a financial mechanism, a credit to that biodiversity outcome. They do exist. They exist. There's several sort of around the world. They're voluntary though. They're not nationally regulated under a government. Even Australia even has a couple of initiatives already underway. There's a really clever one that's just come out in the last 12 months called the cassowary credit. That's one to have a look at as an example of how a biodiversity sort of credit and mechanism could work. It's very new though. I think there's one being developed around koalas at the moment, and you might know more about that. But this will be the first regulated market, nationally regulated market.
Cool. Lyndon, I might move to you and just ask you about, who are the participants in this market, and why do people want to buy nature positive certificates?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's three drivers in the government's mind. I'm not here to obviously explain the government's thinking, but I've spent a bit of time talking to it. The other thing I'd just add on on top of what Jen was describing is effectively what this legislation is it's providing a mirror process to how the existing carbon market operates. So we have an existing carbon market, which particularly but not exclusively is regulated by a thing called the Carbon Farming Initiative that was brought into Parliament back in 2012. One of the things that does is creates a unit, a tradable unit, the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which is a measurable unit to measure 1 tonne of abatement, so 1 tonne of emissions reduction. What this bill is trying to do is create a comparable measure for biodiversity improvement, which is really quite a challenging concept, because carbon up to a point you can measure, you either avoid it, emitting it, or you reduce it, or you abate it, you store it. Biodiversity is a fundamentally new construct, how do you measure a ton of biodiversity? You can't, right? So what this bill is trying to do is grab many of the regulatory learnings of what the ACCU system, the Australian Carbon Credit Unit system, has learned over the last 10 to 12 years, because the system had a lot of fleas on it, don't get me wrong, and trying to learn from that. So they're trying to put in place a strong independent regulator, a strong expert basis, and as Jen said, trying to develop methodologies which can describe what it takes to actually be able to generate a tradable certificate, which will be one of these biodiversity certificates. And it has to be about demonstrating that if you're an investor, and which is getting to your question, Allegra, if you're an investor, how can you be sure that whoever's issuing the credit, the certificate, which can be a private landholder, it could be First Nations communities, it could be government, how can you actually be sure that the state of the biodiversity has been improved? It's quite a big construct, which goes to your question about how many examples are there in the world. Not many, right? So who's the market? Well, there's three ideas around who the market is. One, the market, lo and behold, is the government. Right? The government, as we know, does already allocate significant but not ridiculous amounts of money towards nature conservation and environmental restoration. The federal government primarily does it through a thing called the National Heritage Trust, which is a trust. It's a trust fund. It gets its revenue actually from the proceeds of the partial sale of Telstra backed by John Howard in 1998. And a chunk of the money, I think about $1 billion, was stuck in a trust fund and gathered interest. And the interest is allocated to pay for environmental programs. So that's how most of our national environmental programs actually get funded. They get funded for interest from flogging off a big chunk of Telstra back in the day. So one of the sources of demand for these certificates in the way in legislation has been constructed is it does enable government to buy certificates from landholders, whether they be, like I said, First Nations, private landholders, or other governments, state governments and state land managers, who can demonstrate that they are doing activities that are improving biodiversity. So that's one of the sources of potential demand, and the legislation is quite specific about that. The other source of demand is, and that would not be an insubstantial amount of money, by the way. It wouldn't be billions, and we need billions. It would be hundreds of millions, but nonetheless, in theory, this scheme wouldn't lead to a better outcome than what we've previously had in place, because the National Heritage Trust, according to the Australian National Audit Office, over many different manifestations, has not done a very good job in spending money on good environmental outcomes. The second source of demand that's considered to be out there for these biodiversity certificates is ESG commitments by large corporates. So, large corporates across the world, particularly transnationals that have got operations across many jurisdictions and who operate in the, through high finance, particularly international finance, have increasingly found themselves both under pressure from shareholders and investors, also from consumers and customers, and also from their own staff to improve their environmental performance, and to recognise that, the generation of their profits often involves, destroying the environment. So there is a movement and there is genuine money, and particularly when you look at institutions like the Business Council of Australia, that represents the sort of 150 odd largest publicly listed companies in Australia, there is a genuine sort of policy change that's occurring amongst a number of those members to actually invest in ESG, because they see it as being in their, both important for their bottom line, but also as part of their social license to operate, and that's being also buttressed by a number of international initiatives like the Task Force for Financial Disclosure, which is an international process which is requiring larger transnationals to disclose where their operations, what their operations are doing to the environment and to nature. So there certainly is a pile of money probably sitting out there from the largest sort of companies in Australia that would be directed to wanting to go and buy high integrity biodiversity certificates. The last place, which Jenna and I will talk about probably more in the next section, is through reforms that are being proposed by the Australian government to biodiversity offsetting schemes. And offsetting schemes are very controversial. There is development, as we know, occurring in Australia of all different shapes and sizes, whether it's big mines or it's urban development or it's whatever, like Australia has a lot of development going on. As developers seek to get new projects up, they do actually need approval from governments, whether it's at local level, the state level, or national level. For those projects that are going to impact on these things called matters of national environmental significance, so they're the environmental matters that are directly relevant to the Australian government because of treaties they've signed onto or because it crosses state boundaries, they have to get approval for these projects from the Federal Environment Minister. And part of getting approval is making a determination about, the impacts on matters of national environmental significance. When those impacts are considered to be significant but not irreversible, the federal government sets up a scheme where essentially developers are given approval to undertake their operations and to, clear bush, dig big holes, do whatever. But in return, they have to offset the impacts of their developments by finding other parts of, by spending money essentially on trying to protect comparable parts of the environment elsewhere in the landscape. So that's called offsetting. And I suspect deep down, one of the things that this government wants to do is the offsetting schemes have been a farce in Australia. Graham Samuel went to town on the offsetting schemes in the review. I suspect one of the biggest sources of demand for these biodiversity certificates will ultimately be for a reformed offsetting scheme for large developments.
Okay. Lastly, I just want to wrap up this section quickly, but is in terms of what's the positive case for this market, Lyndon, if you could cover that quickly, and then we'll move on to sort of concerns about it.
The size and the scale of the problem is eye-watering and complex and requires innovation. Most of my colleagues in the movement who I love dearly and who I've worked with forever make a very good case. They say the government should be spending more on environmental restoration and protection, and I agree with that wholeheartedly, right? So I'm not going to defend the case against that. We need to spend a lot more. But the size and the scales of the problem are genuinely quite immense. I've spent most of my life campaigning and working in regional and rural Australia, and the places that need the most attention, where the degradation is the most extreme and where the solutions are not easy, are on private land. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, Australian governments do not like directing private landholders how to manage their land. And a substantial part of Australia is either managed through freehold land owned by, whoever, or it's Aboriginal land, which has many of the same rights as freehold. 60–70% of the continent is not state land. It is land owned as some form of freehold. The farmers in particular do not like government sticking their nose in. The problems are often complicated. You think about, it's not as simple, for example, saying let's go and plant more trees. If you've cleared all the land 3 generations ago, all your topsoil is now sitting in the Great Barrier Reef or in the Pacific Ocean. It's not sitting where it used to be. We need to innovate and work out how to restore country in places that have been fundamentally modified. That's going to take innovation. It's going to take a lot of investment. So my starting point around what the benefits of this could be is there is a big role for government investment. Don't get me wrong. There's a big role for government regulation. But unless we can bring in revenue, money at scale and innovate at scale, and there's a bunch of things public servants are good at, and there's a bunch of things they're not necessarily good at. And going out and walking around with a cocky and working out how to go and plant trees in the right places and doing all the rest of the stuff is not something I'd be encouraging Canberra public servants to be doing. We need private investment. We genuinely need entrepreneurship, and we need a pile of dough that is much more substantial than government. That's why this.
That's okay. Okay. Well, then let's move to the concerns. I'll start with you, Lyndon, then I'll move back to you, Jen. Do you have any concerns, Lyndon, about how the market has been set up, and what are environmental organisations and investors saying?
Yeah, well, there's a few, and partly it's because it's new. There is a genuine problem. I think for the environmental movement and like-minded souls, there is this basic concern that ultimately the feds are trying to delegate responsibility for funding to the private sector whilst not ponying up to help solve the problem with their own dough. There is a genuine issue there, and I think that is something that will need to be addressed. Your constituents would know this: the amount of money that goes into bridges, dams, fossil fuel subsidies, etc., compared to what goes towards the environment. It's not comparable, right? So the first point is, yes, we need to partner up with private capital, but it would be great if the federal government and the states put more money towards the environment, given how fundamental it is to the health and prosperity of our country and the sustainability of our country. So that's the first one. The second one is really around how effective the regulatory environment's going to be that sits next to this market that's being created. You know, as I said, Graham Samuel was clear in 2019 that the regulatory system was broken, was ineffective, and didn't have the tools available to it. There are things that the government should be doing. For example, as you said at the outset, Allegra, we shouldn't be logging native forests anymore, right? We shouldn't be clearing 20 million hectares of bush over the last 24 years. You know, we shouldn't be doing those things. There is actually a regulatory element to that, which the market shouldn't be solving. They should be actually just fundamentals, given what we know about the state of the environment, given what we know about how important the health of the environment is to all sections of our economy. There are things we shouldn't be doing. So there's a genuine concern that, in fact, government's going to move from making any hard decisions about saying no to things to just say the market will fix it, okay? The last thing is we have learnt lots of lessons from the operation of the carbon market. And we have learnt that without strong expert opinion, without transparency, without a strong independent regulator, the carbon market at various times over the last 10 years has been badly wrought. You know, the work of Andrew McIntosh and others in the Australian Institute has shown us where the carbon market has been poorly run, has not delivered emissions reductions at the scale that would be required, and needed reform. And that was what Ian Chubb, the former chief scientist, found in his review that was released earlier this year. So we need to make sure that if we're going to create this new market, it actually learns the lessons. And then I guess the last thing I'd say, Allegra, before handing to Jen, is this measurement issue is a big deal. You know, like I said, a ton of carbon comparatively is easier to measure and understand than a measurement of biodiversity. What my chair, Ken Henry, always says is if we're going to issue these biodiversity certificates, the certificate has to not just demonstrate what activities would be undertaken on the land to generate a certificate and then make a financial instrument. It has to demonstrate that there's real outcomes. You know, you can't just put a fence in place. You've got to show that the fence is protecting threatened species habitat, and then you've got to have it verified and you have monitored. There's genuine, real issues sitting under that. So that's my starting sort of point around that.
Well, look, I might then move on to biodiversity offsets and start the conversation with Jen. So to talk, can you explain biodiversity offsets, you know, the problems, benefits, and how these offsets will be treated under the Nature Repair Act market?
Yes. So I think Lyndon, you know, essentially earlier explained what the offset is. So, you know, that it's a requirement on people who are doing planning development to go away and compensate for the impact they're going to have on the environment and to offset that environment in a way that's supposed to be, you know, sort of like for like. And we know that the offsets, so as Lyndon said, have failed, and that's what Samuel Christus has said. So, and the other thing is that, you know, before they even get to the offsets, they're meant to do the hierarchy of avoid, mitigate, and then offset. But because these offsets the opportunity for offsets has existed, they've literally just, you know, on a number of occasions skipped all the avoid and mitigate and just gone to the offsets because that's easier and they can throw some money at it and not, you know, not genuinely, you know, consider their impact. So the way that the nature repair market is supposed to be or has been set up so far, it's actually really not clear. And that's what actually a really big problem about that is that they haven't been clear about how they're dealing with offsets under the market legislation. And so it hasn't been really talked about at large, and there's not a lot of clear information as to how. But what we do know is that they do want the opportunity to have offsets in the market. So what might happen is, under the tradable certificates, like under the projects, the people who are purchasing those certificates from a supplier, from a landholder who's doing conservation, or from an ENGO who's doing conservation in the market and undertaking a project under the rules of that market, under the nature repair market, they do that, and then someone will come in and purchase those certificates, and it, instead of it being a nature positive, like a thing that's just being done to repair and conserve, it actually could be traded to someone who is just using it as an offset to offset their impact. And so we have, you know, I mean, many people have concern about how that is going to work. You know, we know that they're reviewing the offset standards under the EPBC Act reforms, and they're developing new offset standards, and there may be new rules and better requirements. We should hope so. But there will be people in this market who don't want to trade their work for an offset. They will want it to be a nature positive offset. So they will want it just to be done for the sake of repairing, conserving and restoring. So that's, I guess that's the general gist, is that there still needs to be a lot more work done to understand who can purchase it, how who can, like, how the offsets will work in the market. What we would like to see is that they are treated very differently from a nature positive project. So a project that is just wanting to do it, the repairing, conserving and restoring and trade on that, the positive impact to nature, that anyone who is in the market seeking an offset, that if they purchase it as an offset, that they will be, they will have like very different rules and requirements, much stricter rules and requirements, that they will be valued differently, that they will be transparently reported differently. There's a raft of requirements that we're going to seek, or that we will be hoping for under, if offsets are allowed in the market.
Okay.
I guess I should also just say that that's the other thing about what Lyndon was saying about the Chubb review and our learning from the carbon market, is he was very clear that that a market with integrity, the market that is very transparent about how, what's being verified, what's being measured, what's being valued. And there's still a lot of transparency to go.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm going to move now to questions from the floor, because I know it's been, we've covered a lot of ground, but I want to make sure that we still let people off in time. Joe, I know you've been going through the questions. Do you want to sort of get, I'm sure there's some groupings of different ones. Do you want to give us a couple that you will hand to Jen and Lyndon?
Yep. So maybe the most recent one, Jen, is a kind of continuation of what you were just talking about, is just around some of the, what's happened in the carbon market. There's been those approved methods have been skewed towards certain types of projects. Need to keep politics and money out of this, and mixed rates out of this. Can you just talk about how projects will work in this new market?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea is, so how will the projects work? That, like, so essentially first they're going to have to nominate, like a carbon market, they're going to have to nominate which method or what method they're going to apply to conserve nature. So, and there will be a raft of methods, hopefully many methods that get that are science-based and that are can demonstrate additional, restoration, conservation, and ongoing protection over length of year. Those projects will be given a time frame. They will be given, like, hopefully 25 plus years. Hopefully there'll be methods that will be forever, and or 100 years plus, or even more. So, and those methods will demonstrate how they will be planning on their conservation, how they'll restore their conservation, and verify and report. So, but the thing is that, as you said, with the carbon market, some of these methods have been proven to be, or there's been sort of constant review and queries as to whether or not they're generating the actual outcome of the sequestration or the emission reduction. And so, again, these methods will have to stand up and stack up and be shown. And we're really hoping that, as we said, they'll be science-based and high integrity. Does that help? Lyndon might be able to answer this.
For Lyndon, there's a couple of questions here around, who is the regulator in this market? Who is going to be ensuring that there is this integrity?
Yeah, so what the bill says is a few things. So what the bill does is it establishes one regulator So there's an existing regulator of the carbon market, which is called the Clean Energy Regulator. And the Clean Energy Regulator was taken to town by the Chubb Review a little because it had many different roles. It was both a regulator and a proponent of these different methodologies, and it was also an industry developer. So one of the things that Chubb recommended and what the government has accepted is that the regulator should be a regulator, it shouldn't be an industry facilitator. So the proposal under the bill is the Clean Energy Regulator will regulate the operation of the marketplace, and that will be its sole role. So it will establish whether or not the projects are doing what they're meant to be doing. It will monitor and evaluate. How the methods would be then developed is going to be sent to an expert panel. So an expert committee is being established. I think it's like a 5 to 6 member expert panel whose job is to review the proposals around how different strategies to protect biodiversity will be accredited. So that's an independent expert panel. It will make recommendations. It will make recommendations to the minister, and the minister will determine whether or not these methods should be adopted, and therefore whether or not a biodiversity certificate can be issued, which is, as I said, a tradable instrument. So the minister under this scheme becomes the final decision maker. It's one of the areas where I'm not wildly comfortable. The government is going through the process of establishing an independent National Environment Protection Agency, which at this stage is largely going to have a role around providing final advice on the approval of large projects. I actually think the EPA, as it gets constructed over the coming 6 months, would be in a much better position to be actually making the final decisions about essentially signing off on how these tradable instruments get created. But what the legislation says at this stage is the Clean Energy Regulator will be the regulator. It will monitor and review and audit the effectiveness of the scheme. And it says that the expert panel will be the final port of call in terms of making that last recommendation to the minister around whether these methodologies, these biodiversity methodologies, are suitable.
Okay. There's a couple of other questions in the chat, more which go to sort of priorities, and I guess the 2 groups of them. One is sort of why are we doing this nature repair market before we do the EPBC reforms, and why is the government sort of prioritizing bigger spending items like tax cuts or defence spending ahead of spending on the environment? So, Jenna, I see you've eagerly come off.
I'll answer the first one, and then Lyndon can answer the second one on that one. So the first one about the order of why the nature repair market is being put forward before the EPBC Act reforms. We have the same question. So in our submission, and I think Pew is talking regularly with all the sort of major conservation organisations who are also putting submissions and their advice on this as well, looking really closely at this nature repair market. And we've had the similar conversations with the minister and with the government to say that we would really like to see a lot more action happen on the EPBC Act reforms, and we'd the offset standards to be out and to be tested and to be reviewed before that those offsets enter the nature repair market. But yeah, the order of priority. But I would say though that there is a lot of work happening on the reforms right now, so it's definitely not like it's not happening. Our understanding is that it's sort of working concurrently, and yeah. But I'll let Lyndon ask the other money one. Answer, sorry.
Money one. The money one. Can you restate the question, Joe, just to be...
It was more about, I guess, as a question on relative government priorities. Should we be spending more on, environmental protection in terms of, direct government spending?
Yeah. So look, I think the answer, I might have said this earlier on, I think the answer is yes. Given the size and scale of the problems, given the federal government legislative responsibilities to protecting the environment, we need more core funding. There's no doubt about it. The minister has done a reasonable job in the first 12 months of getting more money into the environment. So, I want to acknowledge her there. There was quite a bit that was important funding that came out of the last budget from last week. A lot of it, however, was going towards enabling policy change, which was actually important. So there's like 80 million bucks that's been set aside, for example, towards establishing a thing called Environment Information Australia, which is something that Graham Samuel recommended, which is essentially creating one standard database of the state of the environment. So you can actually measure improvement in condition. You'd be amazed how little information is publicly available to decision makers when they have to make really important decisions. So they're investing in important things. They put a couple of $100 million towards things like threatened species protection, which was a real commitment. So I don't want to say the minister in her first 12 months hasn't started to change the dial a little from the previous 9 years of defunding of environmental protection programs. But I would say that there is a lot more that needs to be allocated out of the public purse to complement what may come from the private sector and through things like the carbon market, the nature repair bill. As I said before, structurally, the way environment gets funded in Australia, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, is almost entirely out of the National Heritage Trust, the interest accumulated out of the sale of Telstra back in 1998, 1999. That is quite a constraint on the available sum of money. And I think if we don't like that, then there's a whole bunch of work we all have to do as individuals and organisations to suggest that there needs to be a bigger pile of money. Part of the way reformers inside the public service and government and outside in business and elsewhere are trying to deal with that is they're trying to create things called natural accounts, So one of the problems with contemporary economics is that it essentially treats environmental degradation as it has no cost. And if it has no cost, then there's no need to invest in restoring that cost. And so there is quite an interesting bit of work going on inside government around establishing these natural environment accounts, which, if they were picked up, would probably change the debate around the cabinet table, because suddenly it wouldn't be the environment minister arguing for a furry critter over here. It would be the treasurer saying this is a core part of our national economic accounts. I don't know, that's a good answer, but that's kind of, that's what it looks like from where I'm sitting.
So the other thing is the 30% commitment, the 30 by 2030. So I think, this government is hoping that the nature repair market will help them, grow conservation to get to that target, but it's not going to happen fast enough. So, and the government is very much aware of that, and so are a number of, conservation and nature organisations, and so they are going to have to grow their investment to get to that 30% target, which they've committed to globally and internationally under the CBD. So there will be a requirement for a range of other initiatives and mechanisms, from government to get to that target.
I think we're going to have to sort of wrap it up with one final question, Joe. Any of the other ones is there anything else there that you think is super pressing? Otherwise, I'll just wrap it up to make sure we finish on time.
Maybe a sort of a paraphrase of a question in there, Allegra, is just to people to get your perspective. I guess any changes or amendments that you and the members of the crossbench are thinking about.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Look, where the crossbench is talking about this, and certainly I think there's a lot of concern about it. We're at the moment looking at two potential amendments. One of them is one that it's effectively not so much amendment to the bill, but it's basically trying to say make a point. And I think very much the point is the point that Jen made, which is effectively, we want to see the EPBC Act done first before this, because we think that would be the right way to do it, and to ensure that you've got sort of the integrity of the market. Setting up the market without that integrity is potentially quite dangerous. And so that is really our that's for the sort of one kind of point that we're going to make. It's not going to change it. They are going to put this through the Nature Repair Act through regardless. But I think that's, you know, probably that's my probably biggest concern. And the second, the second amendment, what we're doing is pretty much the comment again, I think that Jen made, or maybe it was Lyndon, saying effectively, we believe that people should be able to effectively make a sort of get a credit or a nature positive certificate, but create a nature positive certificate, but say, I don't want this to be used for offsets, because there will be people out there, and I've got, you know, certainly people I know who are passionate about, you know, building this nature positive credits, but they don't want them to be used by another company to degrade the environment elsewhere. They want this to be a nature positive credit and to be an investment in nature. So I think those are the two things that we will be doing, but we at this stage, but we're still considering, we're still talking to experts, to the community, and to other crossbenchers to understand what everybody else is doing as well, and trying to make sure that it is reasonable.
One thing to worth noting, Allegra, just on that is obviously, you know, you're in the reps, so you've got to kind of use your influence in the reps, but there is a Senate committee inquiry that has been called into this act, and so that's the Environment, Communications, etc. committee. It's chaired by Senator Karen Grogan, who's from Labor, and Senator Hanson Young from the Greens. Submissions close, I think, on the 1st of June. I would still suggest that, despite the bipartisan commitment, that committee process could be quite influential. I hope so. And I've seen, you know, some of the submissions so far, which I think have been, you know, influential. Labor does want this to be seen as a good thing. So I think there is a community pressure piece that if the environmental movement is saying this is just not frankly good enough, you know, they will want, you know, they want to get a win out of this effectively. So, you know, and I think they genuinely want to do something useful. But you know, I've got those concerns. But yeah, I agree with you, Lyndon. That's a good place. It's a good place for this community to make submissions to make the point. But also we're looking at what comes out of that Senate committee as well. 100%.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to call that to a close. I just want to thank Jen and Lyndon so much, both of you, for your time tonight. Thank you for the Wentworthians, for your interest and for caring about this, and for your passion, and for continuing to push me on this. You know, I'm going to, as I said, we're still working on this. You know, we think the bill will come to us next week. You know, but it's, again, it could come up later, you don't know. So we are really paying attention to this, and we'll be working, you know, to both continue to build our understanding, listen to feedback, and look at amendments, and working across the sort of House and Senate to do what we can to make this as an effective piece of legislation as possible. So please feel free to email any further comments or questions through as well.
And just an offer, Allegra, look, I've got a bit on my plate, but I saw a lot of fantastic chat questions coming up, which I was desperate to get into. If your office wants to send them through, I'm happy to spend some time trying to fire stuff back to you guys that you can send back out to your community.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. There's a couple of questions there that I can help answer as well. So
thank you. You can see that this is a very well informed community. They know what they're talking about, and they really, you know, have a lot of really detailed and important questions. So thank you both. Well, that's a very generous offer. We'll send those through. Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
have
everyone.
a lovely evening. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Yeah, I think it's just you leave, and it will do it. So if you just end, that's it.